inquiries we get. And that would be, first of all, how to find private staff, and then what the sort of pros and cons of that would be. So that we've decided to do a presentation around it, and I'll qualify what we're about to listen to with, this is not going to cover everything, it never does. And at the same time, I like these conversations to be exactly that, a conversation. So feel free to interject. Nisa's kind of watching for questions coming in and things like that, but at the same time, if something that we're touching on in the moment requires a bit more explanation, or you've got a story or something to add, we have questions sort of saved some time at the end, saved for that kind of thing. But at the same time, don't hesitate to sort of get Nisa's attention, and we'll try to get the question answered in real time. So first slide, Nisa. So a little bit about us. Anyone who's joined our webinars before knows most of this, but we'll quickly touch on the fact that Seniors Come Chair is now Umbrella Community Service Society, and we've got all kinds of neat things, like our new signs are up, so most people are sort of getting it now. Our mission is to enable older adults, their families, and caregivers to lead full, engaged, and meaningful lives, keeping our core values of integrity, respect, compassion, inclusiveness, collaboration, and excellence front of mind. We offer services through our day programs, dementia caregiver and family services, and community services. We've been supporting our community for 45 plus years, and we have 50 employees and over 100 volunteers. Those numbers in terms of volunteers are always changing, and a huge upswing right now since we've started to become normalized again post-pandemic. So again, thank you all for joining virtually, and we'll move on with the next slide. So this is just a bit of bragging in terms of, this is one of the key areas that we focus on in dementia caregiver and family services. This is a grant-funded program made available through Peace Arts Hospital Foundation. Nisa oversees most of our services in this area, and one of the key highlights, as well as part of this educational series and things like that, is our respite services that we have received funding for another 3 years. We just recently received word from Peace Arts Hospital Foundation, Healthy Communities Grant Committee, that we've been approved for to continue our pilot project that ran for year 1, for years 2, 3, and 4. So really excited, and that will only lead to more of this kind of content. Next slide, please. So touching on some of the basically a definition of a private caregiver. Private caregiver is employed by the caregiver. My screen's in the way. Let me see. There we go. By the caregiver and or family without any intermediary agency. You as the caregiver family are the employer and are in charge of screening potential candidates. Private caregivers usually provide non-medical care except in very rare cases. I would say that's a very sort of accurate description. We pulled that sort of basically off the internet. And yet, when you're hiring a private care staff, they can have different qualifications. So it oftentimes is a very blurred line between medical and non-medical assistance. One of the key criteria we want to be aware of all the time is that what is the qualifications of the individual providing care. So moving on to the next definition. And some examples of how you would access that were listed across the bottom, and these are no specific preferences given to, I might highlight a few things in terms of where I find I really like care.com. Indeed is probably the go-to for any sort of job. So most people are sort of caught up in, well, if I'm looking for a private care provider, Indeed is a really great option. Both looking for potential care staff as well as posting your own ads. So moving on to the other definition. And again, some listed providers of agency services. It's not extensive. There's just a few of those that we work closely with listed along the bottom. And home care agencies are licensed to refer caregivers to provide in-home care. They recruit and professionally screen and handle legalities of caregivers who are sent to the home of your elderly loved one. I mean, we're given the work that Brella does in terms of serving older adults, that would be consistent with the messaging for today. But most home care providers will service the needs of anyone in a home setting, whether that be somebody living with disabilities or somebody at the end of life. There's all kinds of different sort of things that fall into the middle category. And one of the things that you'll find when looking for caregivers is the distinction between somebody who's providing childcare, which is quite different, and sort of where to, because if you're looking at different areas that services are posted, that's primarily the distinction you want to be making sure that that's what their qualifications meet, that they meet the needs of elderly individuals and the different needs that come about because of that, as child and youth services do differ quite a lot, and the experience therefore the same. Moving on to the next slide. So a little bit about pros and cons for each of the two sort of subject areas. And I mean, when we're talking about private care staff and agency care staff, you can't help but have in Canada, where there's a crossover or a bit of an overlap in terms of where the health authority will also assist in that. So as much as we're not focusing on that today, anyone who's not quite clear on something and where one area, service area starts and stops, then by all means I can help clarify if possible. The reality is, when it comes to the health authority providing services, it's at their discretion. You have to have a need based on their assessment. Whereas in both of these situations, a private care staff or an agency that you're hiring, you're in control of that. And you're basically saying, this is my need and can you help me with it? So without further ado, the pros, and again, this is not exhaustive. These are some highlights. Oftentimes I use these as notes to sort of keep me on track. And sometimes what I've stated may not make a lot of sense, but it hopefully does to me and I can get the point across. But a pro probably the greatest pro in terms of hiring a private care team. And I emphasize the word team because even though it may start off with one individual, maybe perhaps meeting the needs, over time that becomes very taxing, and it's not really advised that, especially as needs normally grow, that you also consider adding to the team or diversifying a little bit so that that person has adequate breaks and things like that. But without question, the greatest benefit is the continuity of having a familiar face arriving to provide care on a regular basis. It's interesting because the health authority has a different take on providing that kind of continuity. It's not considered a high priority, and it's always struck me strange, and I certainly know that's not across the board thinking in terms of Fraser Health or any of the other health authorities. But it is, from an executive standpoint, sort of a standard that continuity, when the health authority is providing services, they are providing a service. It is not an individual. So the emphasis is not placed on, Karen or Sally showing up on a regular basis so they get to know Margaret very well. And that's just not the emphasis, whereas we know the benefit of that. And so one of the keys in terms of either of these two options, in terms of private care staff or an agency, it's more easily controlled with a private care staff in terms of that continuity. We work with agencies also that place that as a very high value. I think it's important that you emphasize that it's of importance to you as well. In most instances, whether it be private staff who are looking for employment or those in an agency, they do know how important that is. And in some of these instances where I've got them listed as a pro or a con, I'll try to identify why I've put it there. But as in most instances, the flexibility and availability of an individual you're hiring is probably greater than an agency where, because it's scheduled. And so, for instance, if you have somebody who's arrived from an agency that day and something's occurred and you're running late to get back, and you need them to stay if at all possible, they're not likely to have that option. They may be able to work out something with scheduling at their with their administration and things like that, but very typically you'll find more flexibility around availability and things like that, a greater understanding with an individual. So I think that that's where, again, there's a greater value placed on that. When you start to get to know somebody, and one of the greatest challenges we do find with private staff is that the really good ones, people who are really great at their job, are in super high demand. So I say flexibility and availability is a pro in terms of private care staff, knowing that it can also be a bit of a curse too, because they're in very high demand and they probably have a client list waiting for their services. One of the, again, another pro would be the cost for private care staff. I get a little bit further into actual costs, some cost breakdowns, some general cost breakdowns further on, but certainly it's across the board. Normally, the overhead that an individual has compared a company who's offering the services, they don't compare. And yet there's also a good reason why there are those additional costs that a for-profit business or a business period, even a nonprofit, has to cover those the additional expenses. So typically a private care provider will be less expensive across the board, whether it be providing companionship services, certified care aid services like personal care and things like that, and nursing services. You will find that there's some flexibility there because of the cost overhead that they don't have, that a company would. I put this in as a pro because I think it's the nature of providing care to people is very fluid. You can try to schedule things, you can try to create routines, and it's really important to do that, but it's also very important to keep in mind that that will probably not maintain. We're dealing with human needs and a constant ever-changing of those needs. So when it comes to communicating, again, where somebody's not feeling well that day, or could you do this instead, because this is what would be from the perspective of somebody communicating to the caregiver to say, I know we were going to give my father a bath tomorrow, but is there any way you could give him a bath this morning because he's had a really rough night and he vomited, or whatever the case is. When something is scheduled for a set period of time, when it comes to an agency, sometimes that flexibility is just not there. They haven't been scheduled for enough time to adequately alter the schedule. And so just the general availability to communicate with a private caregiver is typically greater. You are communicating directly with them as opposed to through a staffing or scheduling service provider. You're not calling the office, you're typically calling them or texting them or whatever. So communication is generally a little more convenient in trying to make adjustments or communicate things, which we know is quite valuable, because it's ever changing. And so to have that ability to say, I know this was our plan for today, but could we do this instead? And hopefully, again, there's also that ability to adjust with an individual who's there for the sole purpose of providing care to your loved one that day, and they're not really as stringent about what may be in a care plan or not. So cons in terms of private care staff would definitely be scheduling and staffing, and I presented from the perspective that all falls on you. You as an employer of private care staff are the administration, the HR. You're screening people, you're staffing them, scheduling, and when things happen, which they're guaranteed to, as I've highlighted there, they will happen, then it's up to you to fix. You have to either call on another person, deal with those things that arise. And as you'll see in the next slide, that basically that's one of the things you're paying a premium for when dealing with an agency. That is their problem to fix, not yours. And so I can't emphasize enough that the single biggest challenge with hiring private care staff is that it's not hands-off. It may be a degree of removal from the day-to-day task of caregiving, but it's not hands off at all. There's a lot of things that you have your hands in still. It may provide you an escape, a little bit of respite to go do some other things, but there's still probably care related. You're still shopping or doing something else, but having somebody in the home to provide personal care and the reassurance that somebody's there in case something happens is the primary goal of care staff. And when it becomes more comprehensive, where it's, again, I touch on later, where it's more of a 24/7 trying to keep somebody in their own home for as long as possible, it becomes quite a balancing act to keep all of that scheduling going, and quite a deep team, I might add too. Again, a con would be the things that I've already touched on in terms of managing a payroll. Quite oftentimes, private care staff are paid as a contractor. They're going to invoice you for it. There's a pro and a con to that kind of thing, where if you are, depending on what you've negotiated with them, if they are operating as a sole proprietor or have a business or something like that, then it can be fairly straightforward in terms of them invoicing you. All of the other things that become part and parcel with having an agency provide an employee to you, again, are you shoulder those responsibilities in terms of there might be reimbursements of expenses that have come up throughout the week of work. You're also, depending on how conscientious you are about these kinds of things, because this is very personalized, you want to make sure that you've got certifications, like copies of these things, to ensure that the individual is certified to do certain tasks. The one thing that I emphasize about how to get around these kinds of things, that if you have obtained information about a private care staff, depending on the source, you can pretty much be assured that if they work in a healthcare setting, then they have those things. It's still advisable that you get copies of them, things like a driver's abstract, and depending on what they'll be doing for you. But at the same time, that's one of the reassurances that I tell people not to get too hung up about in terms of the qualifications, so to speak. If they work in healthcare, they've probably been exposed to a criminal record check. Those are important things. So I think that, again, if you're not finding obvious solutions to knowing that somebody can produce a criminal record check for you or other certifications, that is, it can be a little unsettling in the sense that how do you obtain the peace of mind that you're looking for in terms of being able to leave somebody in the care of your loved one, or them looking after in the care of your loved one, them looking after your loved one, again, with the peace of mind that you've gone for the day, and knowing that they will be able to tackle anything that arises. I put also in the cons the flexibility and availability. As a con, I already sort of touched on it, in the sense that in instances where there is a degree of flexibility, because you've developed a personal relationship with this individual and you know kind of what else they might have on an agenda for the week, and you can say, is there any chance that you could extend your hours on Thursday or whatever? You're dealing directly with that person. It can also be very specific. No, I can't. I don't have any flexibility to that. And again, oftentimes it's related to other obligations they have, maybe personal ones. Oftentimes you do have individuals who are caregivers. Oftentimes they're the go-to for their own family as well. So understanding there's a balance being struck there. And I've also listed as a con that later becomes a pro in terms of from a private caregiver standpoint, and that's confidence and trust. Listed as a con, as I said initially, because these are strangers to you. Typically, you're not going to know them, and this is a very intimate kind of request that you're having of them to look after your loved one. Typically, that doesn't take that long. I mean, this is an interview or a job process just like any other job, and you're hoping to get the answers that make you feel more comfortable as you interview them and negotiate services and stuff like that. But initially, there's a bit of a leap of faith in terms of that confidence and trust. So, but in most instances, there's a gut feeling. We all have to be very wary of individuals who are looking to capitalize on their position dealing with vulnerable adults. We have to keep that as top of mind, but ultimately you're also getting a sense of this person's moral values and things like that, and hopefully that starts to come through. And in any situation, you are also going to be following up with, regardless of how they came to you, whether a friend referred them or whatever the case is, you can be somewhat satisfied that if they're working directly for somebody else that you know of and they can speak highly of them, that you don't have to go searching too far into somebody's past. But at the same time, you still want to have references and more than just the one person who you may have in common. I think moving on to the pros and cons for an agency employee.
Sure, there's just one comment. There's one, you can slow down just a little bit.
Oh, yes, I will. I will try. It's all very exciting stuff for me. So we have, regarding pros and cons, as I've listed, for using an agency, the again, a lot of this stuff starts to get repeated. I've mentioned somewhere else, but the greatest pro, and some people don't see it as such until they're actually doing this work for themselves, that the all-inclusive service that an agency is providing you, again, may only look like a cost initially, but there's a lot going on in the background in terms of what they are providing in order to make that all happen, in order to make sure that somebody is appropriately insured to do the kind of work that they're doing should an accident occur. Again, if that scheduling issue arises, it's normally not you that would be rectifying it, would be the agency that's doing it. They're in a better position to continue to add to their HR team when they see perhaps deficiencies arising where somebody's just not able to take as many shifts as perhaps say they once were. They can adjust and have the means to do so more than an individual does, because the one thing to keep in mind in the role of a caregiver who's then looking for help is that they're balancing a lot of things. I don't think anyone who's tuning into this or anyone who's had this experience, they all get it, that you're balancing life on top of these other demands. So if you've managed to put together a team of 1 or 2 people that are really meeting needs well, things are marching along splendidly with and you feel a sense of peace of mind knowing that some things have been taken off your plate, so to speak. It's nothing to undo that when it's only a team of 2 people and something happens in their own lives. So it's just something to keep in mind. It's not to put fear in anyone, but that's reality, because these are individuals who also have stuff going on in life. COVID happens and stuff occurs, so you have to be able to roll with it. When an agency is responsible for those things, you feel less of the burden. So again, I've highlighted as a pro the peace of mind. There's a strong degree of peace of mind when somebody is showing up as scheduled. The general getting to know somebody and having a degree of comfort or take place. There's a bit of a settling in period for both private staff and agency staff. They're strangers coming into somebody's home. And so especially the individual receiving care may take some time to warm up. But certainly from a caregiver standpoint, the moment there is help, the peace of mind normally starts to creep in. Reliability is also, I've noted as a pro, mostly from the standpoint that it's a very scheduled routine from an administrative team's perspective. Individuals, if they're not taking their job seriously, won't be hired or won't be employed very long. So you can be pretty sure that they will be showing up on time and completing the tasks as outlined. Again, the pro in terms of when the problem arises, again, I've highlighted here, which is a guarantee to occur, this is typically not your problem to rectify, it will be somebody else's. And if you jump immediately across there, I've sort of qualified that by saying, but ultimately, the responsibility for the well-being of your loved one does rest with you. So even with an agency in place, the stresses of caring for another are never far from mind. Again, I can't tell you enough that if somebody has been managing the care needs of an individual with declining health at home for a period of time, they're probably very taxed. It doesn't take much to sort of become burdened with that responsibility. It consumes your life. And so the moment you introduce, whether it be private or an agency or even a combination of both, that normally the one thing you're trying to create will follow suit, and that would mean that you get a little bit of a reprieve. You can step out of that primary role for a while, at least at certain times of the day, and that's ultimately what you need in order to, if the goal is to keep somebody at home, having their care needs managed in a home setting rather than an institutional setting, then the quicker you can implement assistance of one kind or another, and we're discussing two of the primary ones today, the better. And this is a bit of a daunting process, the whole idea of, again, hiring people, especially for such a very specialized role to look after somebody, and they will very likely be in your home alone and things like that. There's things to consider, yet at the same time, I think that the sooner you do it, the better you will feel about ultimately implementing it. Like many of the things that occur as one ages, oftentimes we have these discussions and then it takes quite a bit longer for us to start to implement these things. So the sooner we start to discuss it, investigate a little bit, the more comfortable you will be with when the time comes, where oftentimes you're pushed in a direction without much choice anymore. At least you will feel better about making those decisions at the time. A couple more of the cons that I've listed under agency, obviously, is cost. And I think I've identified primarily, it's almost a common sense that this is a business and they have other overheads that need to be covered. Some of it's obvious, some of it's not. Again, the individuals that they employ, depending on how they've been employed, but they have holiday time, there's other costs associated with being an employer, especially around home care services. It is things like insurance. It's a very physical task. Most of primary care providing is physical in nature, and so accidents do happen, and you want to make sure that somebody is appropriately insured should an accident occur. And also liability insurance should they be negligent in doing something, and obviously an accident, very likely, but something that they something that's happened and there may be a cost to fixing. Flexibility as a con in terms of, it's not just, it really does depend on the customer service level of the agency you're using, but understanding initially, what kind of lead time do they need for changes, for cancellations. An individual, not that you should take advantage of it, but an individual is typically a little more flexible in that nature. Whereas because this is a larger operation, canceling last minute, there's typically a cost. They'll probably still bill you for that. And making adjustments where it would be, again, you're running late and the individual who's on site doesn't really have the ability to make that decision about staying longer, whereas an individual, a private care staff might. And again, I think I've highlighted, I did on the other in terms of how long it typically takes to trust somebody coming into your home and trust them with the care of your loved one. You should feel fairly comfortable with the idea that this is a reputable organization. You contacted, something about them has impressed part of your interactions with them. Remembering that's not the individual that's going to be showing up, but it should be at least a general sense of what the companies like to deal with. And then normally, as I said, we have found that when we emphasize the importance of continuity with specific care staff, especially for those living with dementia, that having the same person go back for the regular visits or whatever it happens to be, that normally that is also considered a priority for the agency as well. And I'm sure that Sarah can probably speak to that at the end when we're going to be discussing, we're going to have a few more questions and things like that. I think we can probably move on to the next slide. So here I've outlined, again, there's probably other views on this based on personal experience, but this is a bit of a cross-section of costs. Private one side, agency on the other. I've indicated that minimums may apply. I think it's important to remember that when hiring private staff, especially if their rate is more competitive than an agency, it may be part-time work for them, but most people are looking for a reasonable return on their efforts for the day. And to think that a private provider may only want to work an hour, there's a lot involved in actually getting to and from somebody's home and getting ready for the day and things like that. So oftentimes I see more and more where private staffing want to see minimums applied as well. They'll outline them to you, like, minimum 2 hours. And oftentimes, if you're flexible with them, because you have private staff who are trying to fill, in essence, a work week or whatever it is they're trying to fill, but something along that line, they're looking to, create an income. You find it often, a lot of times, these are individuals who may be employed in other areas of healthcare, or this is semi-retirement for them. But going out for an hour is, oftentimes you'll get pushback around that. So if you can be flexible about how you structure the time that they will be on site, meaning that, you'd like it to be only, from a budget standpoint, you only want 1 or 2 hours a day. If you can cluster it so that it was maybe a couple of blocks of 4 hours, and that may not work. I encourage everyone to negotiate and develop a relationship, but at the same time, understanding that that is going to be typically a preference for them is to do blocks of time so that they can also have their services shared with others as well. I touched on when the idea of trying to resource individuals. I'm going to move on to that in a minute, but resourcing people and finding out that individuals have received services from somebody else in the past is one of the key ways of finding reputable care providers. And it's oftentimes helpful to ask them, how did you structure that? How did that work for them? If, again, this person is probably busy, it's ideal to suggest that, I think this would work really well. I would be happy to take what you can offer for the time being in terms of a few hours a week, fit me into where you can, and build that relationship over time. Because as much as the really, really competent, the staff that are worth their weight in gold are hard to come by, there's a fair degree of turnover in terms of servicing the needs of older adults. There's a lot of sort of ebbs and flows through hospitalization and placement in care and different things. So not to be too discouraged when you're trying to develop a relationship with a private caregiver who says, I'm just totally booked. Try not to give up so easily, in the sense that, and completely move on, especially if it feels really good, to try and start working with them on a very temporary or interim basis, I should say. And then hopefully, as their schedules permit, they can give you more time as well. And oftentimes that is another way of, if somebody says, I'm really booked and I don't have any availability, but my friend does, and I work closely with her, we oftentimes see people who are partners, who are the trade-off to one another. So again, you've developed a relationship with two people just by automatically being more open-minded. The costs, as I've sort of are showing here on the screen, from companionship, and so to understand the difference between companionship and a certified care aide. Basically, companionship would be, I would define them for somebody who is providing companionship to an older adult, is somebody who is qualified, who's done that in the past, who will understand typically the idiosyncrasies of what may come up during that time. It's normally the delineating factor is normally the difference between spending social time with somebody that has a great value, but stops short of providing personal care. And personal care, that's a blurry line as well, but in the sense that, so making a meal and doing things like that will sometimes fall into personal care, but at the same time is not, most of us have cooked. And so to understand it, and not all cooks are created equal, but being able to prepare a meal would sort of be in that gray area, oftentimes considered a companionship role. If some of what you really need is some housekeeping or some laundry being done, you really want to identify what you want that person to focus on while they're with your loved one. Is it social time, or is there oftentimes a bit of a period of while somebody's on site that they have a nap and you could do some laundry in the meantime? It's important to understand that this is only going to work if it works for both parties. So the person who's providing services needs to receive remuneration in return for a job that they feel as though, one, they're being appreciated for, and you need, as the employer of a care provider, need to understand that the needs are being met, that it does help to lighten your load. So the difference between companionship and care aid, I think we've sort of covered. You see the price ranges from $18 to $30 an hour. I just, in the last few days, was reaching out to people because I have seen a bit of quite a fluctuation. Costs of everything are more expensive, and one can expect that these kinds of services would also follow suit. $18 an hour, I would say, if I had to sort of say what would that look like, it would be perhaps not a terribly seasoned person, somebody who has a high degree of interest in working in this area, maybe not, again, terribly well versed in the field. And on the $30 an hour range, that would be somebody who understands the specific needs of say, for instance, somebody living with dementia, and what they may have to go in and understand their role to be. It will be quite different from somebody who's completely cognitively aware and, say, minimal need, but lives alone, and family is concerned that they would love, dad to have a bit of companionship. That would be done towards the lower end, and somebody living with dementia, you could expect to pay closer to $30 an hour. And breaking down the rest of them, the range for, again, the care aid services, 25 to 35, LPN services, 28 to 40, on RN, 35 to 50. These people who are certified in nursing care, there is a degree of negotiation that can be done with those things based on what you're needing them to do. Oftentimes, when it's an agency providing that service, it's very specifically outlined why you would need an RN, because an LPN wouldn't meet the qualification to do what it was that you needed help with. Perhaps it would be a dressing change or something like that. That's not a great example, but there may be some specific things that an RN would have to do, and so therefore, and of course, you would then limit how much exposure you had to that, where you wouldn't have an RN sitting around, providing companionship for more than the time that they were there to do another task. I took the opportunity to do a bit of a breakdown of what it's like to have 24/7 home care And that's, again, not normally an individual, it's a team of people. Offsetting a primary care provider in a home setting. There's a ton of variations to the way that this can be structured. Oftentimes there's a live-in arrangement of part of it, where there's normally an offset. There's typically no cost for the room and board. But that may not exist. That may not, the space may not be large enough to house somebody for sleeping quarters. I'm seeing Joan ask about Fraser Health would be considered obviously the health authority agency. I would, for the purpose of this discussion, I would separate them from it because, again, based on their assessments needing to be in place in order to receive the services, period, and then you'd be exposed to an income means test, whereas between private and agencies like Nurse Next Door, Comfort Keepers, and those providing services, you control that. You're controlling whether you hire them or not, and it doesn't have anything to do with the assessment. So I hope that helped a little bit. And oftentimes you have all of these potentially working at the same time. I think that it's wise to be open-minded to that, in a perfect world, if you could cut your costs as much as possible, that's what you'd be doing. Another piece of advice that I oftentimes tell people when they're looking at providing a 24/7 home care plan, so comprehensive, moment to moment, meaning that the family could be away and everything would still carry on without you. And again, an agency covering that period of time, I have never seen it less than $12,000, but I've certainly seen it up to 20 in parts of Vancouver. And you wouldn't be doing that forever. I mean, if you lived in Vancouver, you're probably considering it because you're comfortable enough to consider it. But at the same time, people get a little bit hung up on the numbers, thinking this could be for many, many years. It's normally not for many years. It can be for several. But that's where it's important to, I think if we move on to the next slide, I think I've broken down, it might be on one of the following ones, but basically, I think just to keep in mind that these measures that are being put in place are oftentimes, they're instigated by a deep desire to keep somebody at home and not have them placed in an institutional setting of any kind. And so when we have conversations with Nisa and I sit down with families and talk about what are your goals, what are we trying to achieve here, we will oftentimes, and if you've heard me speak before, I will normally tell the story or make my position clear that people will say, my father's never going to a care home. And I'm the first to say never, because in this place and time, that may be achievable, but any number of scenarios could present itself and that would change it, because it comes down to a will, typically of a family or one family member. And if that person can't do it, it's just an impossibility. They become ill themselves or whatever it is, then you have to be open-minded to an adjustment. But again, normally these two scenarios where you're working with an agency or a private care team, private care provider, there to try and stem the tide of perhaps a placement. And I do strongly feel the earlier you implement it, first of all, the more comfortable you become with it, and the more likely you are to have long-term sustainability in terms of keeping somebody at home, because you've helped to offset some of the burden right off the bat, or as soon as you can. So this is sourcing a caregiver, and this is just a quote from me: "There's more than one way to tackle a problem or approach a dilemma. When it comes to sourcing care staff, I would start with creating a detailed list of what your true needs are, include must-haves and desires, then create an ideal job description in the form of a caregiver wanted ad." I oftentimes say that so much of this stuff is common sense. It really is, and yet it's daunting to most people. So few things are more powerful than word of mouth, and that can be said for just about anybody you're making a referral for. Ask around to neighbors, churches, clubs, associations, others that work in health or home care, and make a point of posting it on social media that you're looking for something. Hope that went away. Could you read that one back to me, Lisa? What that question said?
Yeah, it says, what's an example of an example of an agency would be ? Nurse next door, or does that qualify as private?
Nurse next door or comfort keepers or Bayshore, those would be considered agencies in this particular case. So basically a company providing home care. I know sometimes when we use the word agency in healthcare, it becomes a bit confusing with the health authority, and that's not what we're talking about. So basically a business who's registered to operate their business and provide the services that they do. And the list is somewhat unending. It's a pretty, popular service provision right now. And even that, you have those that have been doing this work for a very long time, who are well situated in the market. And again, Sarah is with us today to speak on some of what Bayshore provides. It will be pretty much across the board about what you can expect. It will be up to you to interview them just like anyone else providing a service to you, and assess their customer service skills and how good they are at saying they will meet your needs. And there's still a bit of a leap of faith, because again, the individual may be very well versed at customer service is probably not the person who's coming to provide personal care to mom. So that being said, I'm a big advocate for a combination. If you can find somebody who's, you live in South Surrey, White Rock here, where we have our demographic is a larger, older adult population, and many of our condo buildings have a large population of older people, and you see the healthcare staff going in and out, whether it be health authority staff or private staff. Asking that neighbor or that person about what that experience was like is hugely invaluable. I think I've touched on that somewhere else. It may not be relevant in your life right now, but at the same time, it doesn't hurt to ask, because these things can occur at any given time. So could you read me what Rena said there, Lisa?
Yep, she said, does the 24/7 care include room and board?
It oftentimes does, because of the continuity that having a room and board space can create. It normally is, it's quite common, but there are the occasions where the space is like a 1-bedroom condo where family is trying to find help for dad, and there may not be a living space for that individual to stay. So it would be a rotational staff, probably a place to take a nap, like maybe a reclining chair or something like that. It's ideal when it includes it. That's my personal opinion. It's having a rotational small team of private staff that have a bit of a live-in component to it is one of the best scenarios. Again, an agency can provide those kinds of services. To have 24/7, going back to the previous slide, it would be very expensive. And so oftentimes, to make it affordable, you still have a large degree of family involvement in order to offset that cost. So you may have staff throughout the waking hours of the day, and then you will probably have, a family member or somebody else responsible overnight, which is normally, hopefully the care is light overnight, but it may not be. It could be quite difficult in the night hours as well. It just depends on what your resources and your network is like in order to be able to do that. So with the list of sourcing caregivers, place an ad. Indeed is one of the best places to look for ads in terms of more so the idea of putting an ad on there for somebody to respond to. And some people question whether, is that really what Indeed would be used for? It's used for a lot of private families post their need for caregiver services on Indeed. I'll show an ad towards the end. One that I was looking for one that was really quite touching and things like that. And for some reason, I couldn't find one because I've seen some great ones, and you can really get a sense of how important this is to get the fit right. And it is really important that the fit is right. This is somebody you're going to entrust your loved one to. I'm a big believer in care.com. I think it's a great platform. You can post on it, so you can post your ad on it and list your specs in terms of what you're looking for, and you can also peruse qualified care, or you can put in your criteria, meaning you fill out filter search criteria, meaning meal prep, transportation, nursing care, and you check the ones that you want, and then it will filter out those that meet those qualifications. Care.com is a subscription cost. They have different degrees of subscription levels. I believe they do anyway. And I think that the best way to prepare to be on care.com or is to look at some other ads. As I said, I'll show one towards the end that has the very basics covered, but would leave no one without an understanding of what this job would look like. Other places would be job boards, Craigslist, posting an ad at a community center or neighborhood houses. This one, inquiring at a local hospital, hospice, assisted living or long-term care at your clinic. Don't ask your doctor, they're probably not going to have time. And they're probably not that well situated for that. You might think that they are, but they're probably not. Receptionist at the clinic probably knows better. Keeping in mind that protocols exist around soliciting private work from staff working in care settings. And what I mean by that is that oftentimes, depending on how you've met somebody, soliciting their services outside of that setting is not necessarily, it's not within their parameters of being able to offer their services outside of that work setting, and so it could be a conflict for them. There's ways around that in the sense that if individuals, so much of private caregiving is it's sort of a gray area in terms of how you acquire somebody's services. Oftentimes that word of mouth may come by saying, Margaret does a great job for me, but she also works in a care home, and I'm not sure how you would, get a hold of her except for me to give you her number, and she's not really, into doing that. I think if you leave your contact information with the individual, the third party who's sort of made this connection, and just say, I will pass it along for you, and then let that caregiver contact you, the ball is in her court or their court. To contact you whether they have availability or not, but pursuing them is sometimes difficult, again, because a conflict can arise. What did that one say? I didn't quite catch that, Nisa. What did it say?
It says, are any of these services already provided if one is in assisted living?
Well, assisted living by nature starts to pick up on some of these assistance with activities of daily living. So there's oftentimes a bit of a crossover. It depends on what the community is licensed to provide. So if it's an assisted living community and your loved one needs assistance with medication reminders or the assistance with medication, they would normally do it themselves. The community would provide that service, and you'd be charged a fee for it as part of your assisted living costs. But that would be a specific care need that was being met by the community. That being said, there are a delineation between assisted living and independent living, whereas again, the area is a bit gray, or can be gray, because people's needs change over time and there's no specific departure from one area to another. In independent living, you normally start, so a senior living setting where there is no specific assisted living, that's where you might see an agency or a private person go in and start to provide shower assist, assist with the medications and things like that. Normally, the benefit of being in a senior setting is also that you have access to people who are servicing or providing services in that community. You've got the staff know them, they can make recommendation, and they may work for an agency and they would tell you that, or they could possibly be just an individual who's done this for a long time and great to work with. And if she or they have got availability, then they'd be happy to pass along your name as well. But it's oftentimes in some truly licensed assisted living communities, some services can only be delivered by the community. They can't be delivered by an outside party, except family, perhaps. Family can take on that responsibility, but because of the liability involved in somebody living in a community and the acceptance of responsibility, that medications would have to be delivered in-house. Hopefully that answered what you were talking about, Joan. I caught only briefly something about a Fraser Health experience. Can you read that to me again, Lisa?
Yeah. All right. Spring 21, a friend used Fraser Health for home care, and it was an extremely stressful experience. The worker often wouldn't show up at the agreed upon time, sometimes not at all, and sometimes no prior notification given to patient. Due to COVID-19 issues, Fraser Health was extremely stretched staff-wise to the max. This free service, because it's government providing, was very poor. I hope to always be involved with an agency in the future, even though it costs money, way less stress, and hopefully Fraser Health has vastly improved their ability to provide service.
That having those testimonials from other people who've experienced it, I mean, I do this work too. So I mean, I do have a personal firsthand experience with Fraser Health, many of them. I can't emphasize enough that the deeper you are in terms of your network of whether it be an agency who you know what it's going to cost, they're a phone call away, they probably need some time to book it, you can't just call them. But the same thing by offsetting private staff and having those kinds of things. First of all, Fraser Health will not provide it, free or not, will not provide it unless there's an assessed need, a need that's been assessed, I should say. They won't. You can see that your mother's no longer able to cook for herself or whatever the case may be, but that's not necessarily their role. And so therefore you won't have access through the health authority. So having these conversations and exposing yourself to what else is available is always, that's what I find important about these kinds of dialogues. Everyone's experience is typically, oh, that's going to cost a lot of money. There's going to be a cost for sure, but I think educating yourself is really important. I noted trying to recall past situations where a family member, friend, or acquaintance may have been in a similar situation and asked their opinion of the experience they had with sourcing care staff. Their insight or possible context could be invaluable. That's what I was just touching on, in the sense that it may just be a fleeting thought that, you know, I'm worried about a neighbor, or my dad's not, you know, we're more worried about him being on his own. There may not be an immediate need there right now, but taking the time to ask somebody about how did that work for you, or what did you do, just so you're a little more prepared. Life is busy, and I'm not suggesting you spend a ton of time on it, but at the same time, if there's things that are niggling at you in terms of, I'm seeing something, I should probably be a little more prepared, you probably should be. And then the logical persons to ask would be somebody who's already walked in your shoes, somebody who's already had that experience. And finally, on this slide, I've noted, this should be, again, common sense, that if you need help with this kind of thing, you can reach out to us, or other organizations like Diversity or Sources or whatever. They may not have as much specific in relation to services relating to caregiver services as Sabrella does, but they can probably point you in the right direction. Next slide. This I made note of this earlier. I was looking for some really touching ads that I'd seen in the past, and I had them saved somewhere, but now I can't find them because they were really heartfelt, poignant ads written by obviously very caring family members that are putting themselves out there. This is a very straightforward ad. I would say if I looked at this, it's pretty clear what the person needs assistance with the task. This has probably been completed. This is an Indeed ad, I think. I'm pretty sure it is. This has been done with drop-down menus, so they didn't do a lot of personalizing this ad, but it's pretty specific about what, if somebody was looking at it, would say, yeah, I know what my expectations would be. $20 an hour is a more than reasonable price. I don't see what their list of experience is here. But if you were to do your own ad, it would need to be at least this comprehensive. It would need to have at least these things in it. And as I said, this was completed through Indeed, so they kind of walked this person through it with the drop down. That the task probably would have had a number of extra that they didn't choose to highlight. But that's when, once you've found a couple of candidates to interview, that you would get more personal about their experience and things like that. Just like any job, you're looking at what they bring in terms of a skill set to the table. If they're looking to do this kind of work, surely, well, maybe they are fairly new, but at the same time, this is very specific kind of work, and you need to be cut out for it, because and that should come through in an interview. It may not come through in an ad, but when you were posting an ad of this nature and then getting responses to it, you should be able to walk through the interview process with, and that oftentimes when people have asked our opinion about, I am looking for private staff, normally we've recommended a few people, hopefully they have availability. So oftentimes they don't have availability, and that's why we're trying to find other resources for them, or different parts of where we're not as deep in terms of trying to provide names for people. But hopefully collectively, if you have a few prospective care providers you'd like our help with, we'd be happy to help, come up with a few questions, review their credentials and stuff like that, and help out with that, because it can be overwhelming. It's a big decision to make. It's a big decision normally to hire anybody to do anything, but let alone this very personal job. Is there a next screen, Lisa? Basically not. Other than, was there anything that we didn't get to in terms of a question that occurred while it was happening?
No, I think we've covered all of the questions. If there's any more, you can either unmute yourself or you can leave it in the chat box.
If people are just taking their time to, oh, there's something.
Yeah. So it says who to contact at Brella Renavigating the Healthcare System.
Nisa.
Yes.
Nisa or myself. And we currently actually have a summer social work student who we're trying to get, all kinds of experience in this area as well. A lot of navigating the healthcare system is a little bit of seeking and find, and obviously we're versed at it, so we can normally be cut through some of the stuff. But having somebody who's just really quite comfortable with that, searching the internet and doing different things, can also be helpful. So Lorraine, who's with us until September, is somebody we're trying to expose to some of the healthcare navigation stuff as well. Anyone else who's thinking of a question? I can't see, but is Sarah there?
Yep, she's.
Yeah. Did you have anything else you wanted to add?
Hi, Richard. A great talk. You were bang on, just on absolutely everything. You covered absolutely everything. I really can see from the questions that it's a bit of a maze. It's a bit of a, who's who in the zoo, and you really clarified a lot. So thank you. That was a great talk. for the caregivers that are on, I just wanted to commend you for your great work as family caregivers, and to let you know that the reason why, you know, people like our caregivers are in this job is because they want you to actually be able to do what's important to you in life and what matters most to you in your day, and still have your loved one with you if that's your choice in your home. And so they can come in and do the things that that you maybe don't want to do anymore. So they're happy to pick up a vacuum and a duster and make a meal and throw out expired food and take somebody to do their exercises, whatever it is, you know, it's kind of, they become part of the family. And as Richard said, the nice thing about you being able to choose is you also kind of get to dictate, you know, what's important to you and what you want done in your home. And you know, we hope that always works out. And as he said, you know, we're all human, so sometimes there's some flux, and you know, somebody comes and somebody goes, and you come and you go, and that makes the business of home care tricky and a challenge, but it's always rewarding. It's always rewarding. So yeah, I just wanted to say thank you. And we've sponsored the prize today, just so that you all know that we're thinking about you, and we know that you are doing the work that paid caregivers do, but you're doing it unpaid. So I want to give you a little treat. So thanks for being here, and I'm happy to stay behind for questions as well.
I was going to expand on the one, I mean, again, there's a crossover in terms of, I think it's important to understand the limitations of the health authority and what their role in terms of home care is. And that really is, again, they will not be able to provide it. You will see a need and they simply won't see it yet. They're normally a higher degree of need has to be present in order for them to even offer anything. But it's important to be proactive with that, to be engaged with, because if you're silent, the one thing that I tell people all the time is that if you're not communicating with the health authority, they think everything's fine. So it's really important to have that combination of saying, and because it also qualifies, we've many times had people say, you know, I can't do this anymore. I want to keep my husband at home, or whatever the scenario is, I want to do that. But I think that the health authority is not in a position to do anything about it yet. But through them taking their own initiative to get care team, whatever it looks like, care resources being implemented, they will see that as also a necessity. It will start to build the case to say that, you know, perhaps we can help with this. That's again a double-edged sword. We've touched on it, that the things that you become really comfortable with, you've paid for and are very satisfied with, the health authority can be a challenging system to navigate. When there is a very specified assessed need, a clinical need, they will put that services in place to keep you in home. It's very slow to respond to changes, and that's why I'm a big believer in having all of these parties working together. If you have, you know, a little, they typically are older ladies, somebody who's providing care to somebody, you know, in the condo building that you live in, and you see her coming in and out, and people talk very highly of her, and then you know somebody else who could use the services, by all means, you know, connect with her and pass that name on, or tell her to put her name up on the bulletin board or something like that. And by all means, reach out to agencies looking for, you know, again, an offset, something to complete your team, so that you're deeper in terms of making sure that literally everything is covered. You've got all your bases covered, and then that will create it will present a true reality to the health authority should you call them in to do an assessment and say, there's no way I could possibly be doing this myself. These are the actions that I've taken. It will help to create that reality. They oftentimes, their go-to, our entire healthcare system is based on family doing it first. So they will normally see it that way. They will see that, well, as long as there's somebody else there. And I would like to think that the person who had the comment about that terrible Fraser Health experience, people not showing up, if people live alone, it's considered high priority. It's essential service in that case. So they should be coming. When there's another adult who can provide some sort of assistance, whether that just be checking on them, they may not be able to help them with anything else, which seems a bit ludicrous, but there's somebody else there and they do not consider it essential then, which is a shame. It really depends that to get around that, the relationship with your case manager is really important for them to understand what that network really looks like. This person lives alone. The rest of the building is of advanced age as well. There's not like somebody available to just help with somebody that doesn't show up, to paint that picture. Because the last thing they want to do is be liable for something that's terrible that's happened as well. Sort of in our heat wave right now that, somebody didn't show up and at least somebody's eyes would have been laid on that person to know whether how they were doing. They don't want that kind of a problem either. So the combination of having connection with the health authority, having them understand your true needs and how they're actually being serviced right now, whether that be you're paying for them or whatever. And then as things change, that you update them. You update their the changes that are ongoing, because the silence, again, they're so busy, they're not going to take the time to, or rarely will they take the time to call you and say, hey, how's it going now? I haven't heard anything. I'm assuming everything must be fine. It will be up to you to sort of reach out and say, we're managing right now, but this is becoming much more difficult. Our goal is still to keep whoever it is at home. What else can we perhaps look at? That's I hope that's a helpful analogy for in terms of Fraser Health. I'm not seeing the whole thing. Can you read that, Nisa?
Yeah, it says, to give Fraser Health negative feedback, is there not the repercussion of even worse service in the future?
Oh dear.
There shouldn't be. There obviously shouldn't be, but I think there's a very fine line, I think, in healthcare in terms of the squeaky wheel. Squeaky wheel in society normally gets the grease and gets a response. There is a bit of a power struggle in terms of if somebody complains and it's the position of the health authority is going to be, your need is no greater than any other person. That's and they're not inaccurate in that. It is, these are qualified individuals to assess these situations. And if they say your need is no greater than anyone else, but we're just maxed, which is not your problem, it's their problem, but it is the problem we deal with. They are super stretched at times. Summer holidays, right now there's every long weekend there's shortfalls in service delivery. My opinion on that is that you don't sit silent when somebody's life or quality of life is at risk. You have to say something, and that should not come with a repercussion of poorer service or something like that. And there's protocol for that too. I mean, if you found that you feel as though you're receiving the short end of something because of something you said, then there's other ways of escalating it. Nobody wants to do that. You want to avoid that at all costs. And I think it comes from a level of a place of understanding. They are primarily responsible for meeting the healthcare needs of the community. Their threshold is pretty high. And that's what I think that's where there's a bit of miscommunication in terms of people's understanding about what the health authority is responsible for. And then to a large degree, again, how has that been communicated? They are not an emergency response. That's what 911 and the hospital and everything else is for. But their mandate is to keep people out of those higher acuity sort of settings. That's what they're looking to do by being more proactive. So it's oftentimes reaching out and sharing with a person of authority, normally your case manager at home health, and saying, I'm just finding this from a caregiver standpoint. I'm finding this really, really difficult. And if I can't, this is only going to get, they know this, but that's the approach I would take with them, to say, I'm really at my breaking point. Don't lie, but it's a pretty understandable situation for people to say, I'm at my breaking point. It would take nothing for me to not be able to do this anymore. So they do have to respond to that kind of speak. They have to, because otherwise that person is no longer at home, they're in the hospital, and it's their mandate to try and avoid that. I think that's enough talk about Fraser Health.
All right.
And I think we'll have somebody. I think it takes a case manager, somebody like a community health nurse, is in a precarious position to do their job, and then field these kinds of individual complaints that they probably had nothing to do with. I know a few of them who have said that they would, and then one reason or another, a manager said, don't do that. Don't go on and have a discussion with the general public. But again, in those who are struggling with either the communication aspect of how to get help, understanding what next steps should be, please reach out. That's what we're here for. And I encourage you to reach out to Bayshore to, have them speak on their own behalf of what kind of services they can offer. As Sarah said, the people that are doing this kind of work, it's very gratifying. It can be largely thankless in the moment. In the moment, you are just doing tasks. And oftentimes you're dealing with people who are not in the happiest disposition. Not sometimes they are, but not always. And by and large, I think those people that are drawn to this kind of work do it out of the goodness of their heart. They get paid, it's a job for them, but at the same time, they're doing it because they're cut out for this kind of work. Yeah. Was there anything else that came up, Nisa?
No, I think that's all the questions. If anybody else wants to unmute right now, you can. Otherwise, Sarah, if you have anything else to add as well, please feel free. Oh, good. Okay. Oh, Beverly, go ahead.
Rick, I just wanted to know, do we have to provide insurance for the private people who come in?
Well, it depends on how it's structured. So there are some things to keep in mind in terms of you having an appropriate liability insurance on your own space. So that would be consistent with anybody who's coming into your place, whether they're cleaning your carpets or whatever. You want to make sure that if somebody slips and falls or whatever, WCB in terms of their own coverage is normally them. It really depends on how you've structured it, because if you are employing, there are a number of families, for instance, who have a business and they're going to actually hire you through their business. It will be in a different capacity. It will be as a caregiver for their father or whatever. They have luxuries that not an individual has in terms of being able to put you on their WCB and stuff like that. It's important that they have those things. As an individual, they need to, because if they injure themselves, they're out of work. And that would be sort of a minimum qualification, is to confirm WCB insurance for an individual. Mm-hmm. Obviously, anyone working for an agency has that. They're getting through their employer. And to make sure that it takes nothing to go to your home insurance provider and tell them, what the scenario is, and saying, am I appropriately covered for anything that may occur? If they damage something like an expensive piece of equipment that, what would happen in that case? Is what would the deductible be? And or what if they do injure themselves or somebody else? I think it's important to be upfront. I mean, those seem like really also, again, daunting things to tackle. But all you can do is get an answer by being upfront and asking the questions and saying, this is my scenario. I want to keep my father at home. This is the way we're structuring it. Am I lacking anything in my own home insurance?
Good, thank you.
You're welcome.
Sarah, I think you wanted to add something.
Yeah, that just made me think of one more thing I might point out, and it has the word insurance in it, but kind of different from the last question. It has to do with your personal extended medical insurance that you or your spouse may have had as part of your your jobs in the past or that you've paid into. Sometimes people are unaware of the coverage they have for some home care.
Yeah.
So for example, Sun Life or Manulife sometimes covers nursing care or housekeeping care in the home. And it sometimes is a reasonable amount that can help out that, that added cost of hiring an agency.
Oh,
For sure.
thank you. Great.
Yeah, and the important thing about those kinds of things, I'm a huge believer in maxing them out, because some people are just not aware of them. Like so you've got mom or dad staying at home or whatever the scenario is, and to make that sense of the experience at home as high a quality as possible, have physio come in, have massage come in. You probably have them. I mean, you'll probably know whether you do or don't have extended benefits, but many times those just go unused, and you have minimums you've already paid for. So to do those things is a huge degree of not only creating a higher quality of life, but can also extend the life of somebody at home, because their mobility is being maintained and stuff like that. And as Sarah mentioned, there's very oftentimes some degree of home care that they would offset. You probably have it, and it's not doing anything by not using it. So look into it and then max it out. Seriously.
So if you are aware of your policy name and number, Bayshore as a free service can look up what coverage there is for you.
Great.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Okay, so if there's no more questions, we're almost ready to wrap up. For the gift basket prize, we had, I think I had drawn Nina, but I think she's left early. So I redraw it again, and Beverly, you've won the gift basket. Yay!
Oh my goodness, thank you. Today's my lucky day.
It is. So I'll reach out to you after this so we can get that to you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks again, Sarah and Bayshore, for providing that for us, and some lovely other caregiver stuff that she provided for our support group.
Well,
You
yeah.
want to join our support group because you get cool things. It's like Oprah's days of giveaway or whatever.
Well, thank you so much, folks.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us.
Okay.
Take care. See you again soon.
Okay.